Welcome to the Little Grey Cells. I'm Arthur Hastings, and thank you for joining me tonight. First, a warm thank you to our listeners from all over the world. If you're new here, subscribe and tell us where you're from. Tonight, Poirot and I find ourselves on a tidal island off the Devon coast, cut off from the world by the rising sea, in a house said to be walked by a Victorian ghost who carries a candle, and whose appearance, legend has it, always precedes a death. The legend, it seems, has come true. Dim your lights, Poirot yourself a tisane, and prepare to exercise your own grey cells. Chapter 1. The Place That Remembers. "You will observe," said Hercule Poirot, pausing on the causeway to regard with profound distaste the grey expanse of sea on either side of him, that the tide is already considering its return. It has, I think, a personal animus against me. Captain Hastings, who had been attempting to keep his hat from the wind, turned to look at his companion. Poirot stood quite still on the narrow stone path, his small feet placed with characteristic precision, one gloved hand gripping the handle of his umbrella, as though it were the last civilized object in an uncivilized world. He was regarding the island ahead with an expression that Hastings had come to recognize. Not fear, precisely, but the careful displeasure of a fastidious man confronted with something he considered poorly organized. "It's rather magnificent, don't you think?" Hastings offered, with the enthusiasm of a man who had spent his youth riding across open country and retained a weakness for dramatic scenery. Poirot said nothing. He adjusted his moustache against the salt wind. It was a losing battle. Blackthorn Abbey rose ahead of them from its narrow tidal island, like something that had been there since before the notion of England had fully formed. The house, if one could call that great grey accumulation of Georgian stone and medieval arch a house, sat square against the sky, its windows reflecting the flat October light, without warmth. Behind it, or perhaps beneath it, the original abbey walls rose in jagged sections, their stones darker, older, stitched into the newer structure with the pragmatic ruthlessness of a later century that had seen no reason to waste good masonry. The island was, at low tide, connected to the Devon coast by the causeway on which they now walked. At high tide, as Hastings had been informed by the somewhat gleeful local who had driven them to the shore, there was no connection at all. The island became, twice daily, entirely its own domain. "This," said Poirot, as they reached the far end of the causeway and his polished shoe encountered damp gravel for the first time, "is a place entirely unsuitable for civilization." Hastings grinned. "Wait until you've seen inside. Lady Margaret's letter made it sound rather impressive." "Lady Margaret's letter," Poirot said, "described, among other matters, a ghost. I do not travel to Devon in October for ghosts, mon ami. I travel because Lady Margaret Vale is a woman of considerable intelligence who is, nevertheless, frightened. That is the thing that interests me, not the apparition, the fear." He said nothing further. They crossed the gravel drive toward the iron-studded door. Blackthorn Abbey received them without ceremony. The housekeeper who answered the door was a small, ancient woman named Mrs. Penbury, whose face bore the particular expression of someone who has spent a lifetime being proved correct about things she had rather not been correct about. She looked at the two arrivals with dark, assessing eyes, dropped a cursory half-curtsy to Hastings, who was taller and carried himself with more obvious authority, and then transferred her gaze to Poirot with an attention that was quite different in quality. "You'll be the Belgian detective, then," she said. It was not entirely a question. "I am Hercule Poirot." "Yes." Mrs. Penbury studied him for a moment longer, with the measuring look of a woman deciding whether a new tool is adequate for a very particular job. Then she stood aside to admit them. "The gentleman was seen last Thursday," she said, as though this explained everything. "Dr. Mercer found the slab on Friday. Lady Margaret sent for you on Saturday." She paused. "I hope you are quick about things." The interior of the house was cold in the specific way of old stone buildings that have absorbed centuries of winter and learned to retain it. The entrance hall rose to a vaulted ceiling. Abbey stonework, Hastings guessed, incorporated whole into the Georgian structure. And the walls were hung with portraits whose subjects shared, across several hundred years of Vale ancestry, an identical quality of watchful reserve. Electric lighting had been installed, but inadequately, and the shadows in the upper corners of the hall were deep and permanent. A fire burned in the drawing room into which they were shown. Before it stood Lady Margaret Vale. She was perhaps 60, tall, with the upright carriage of a woman who had never permitted herself the indulgence of visible fatigue. Her face was handsome rather than beautiful, and composed in the manner of someone who has decided, at some earlier point in her life, that composure is simply more efficient than its alternatives. She held out her hand to Poirot with the particular courtesy of a hostess who is grateful but will not quite admit to being desperate. "Monsieur Poirot, you are very good to come so far." "It is I who am honoured, my lady." Poirot bowed slightly over her hand. "You will permit me to introduce my friend, Captain Hastings, who accompanies me as a matter of his own considerable interest in your remarkable house." Hastings, who had not been warned of this characterization, managed an agreeable nod. Tea was brought. The room was, Hastings supposed, impressive by any reasonable standard. High-ceilinged, furnished with the assured comfort of old money, the fireplace framed by a stone arch that was visibly older than anything else in the room. But the ceiling, he noticed slowly, bore faint remnants of medieval painting. Saints, or what had once been saints, their features long since dissolved into the plaster, their outlines remaining as the ghost of a gesture toward the divine. He mentioned this to Lady Margaret. "The drawing-room was the Abbey chapel," she said. "We have lived as a family with such things for 200 years. One stops seeing them." She paused. "Or one had until recently." Poirot set down his cup. "Tell me, if you please, about the recent disturbances. In your own words, my lady. Begin at the beginning." Lady Margaret looked into the fire for a moment. When she spoke, it was with the careful precision of a woman reporting facts she would prefer not to have to report. "You will be aware, Monsieur Poirot, of the legend of Lord Alistair Vale, my ancestor. He disappeared from this house in the winter of 1892 from a locked room on a night when the tide was high. The story attached to his disappearance, the gentleman who walks the corridors, has been part of local folklore for as long as I can remember. I have never believed it. I have always considered it a perfectly natural consequence of an old house, an unexplained disappearance, and the human tendency toward the picturesque." "And now," said Poirot, "and now I am less certain what I believe." She turned her gaze from the fire to Poirot directly, and her composure held, but only just. "3 weeks ago, my archivist, Dr. Julian Mercer, began an excavation of the old Abbey floor in the library. He had reason to believe there was a vault beneath it. Last Thursday evening, 2 members of my household reported seeing a figure in the upper corridor. A tall figure in Victorian evening dress, carrying a candle. The following morning, Dr. Mercer reported finding a stone slab, recently exposed. By Friday evening, he was dead. The library door was locked from the inside. A candle burned beside his body, and no one can account for how either he or his killer entered or left the room. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved around the abbey walls with the low, uneven sound of something looking for a way in. The legend, Lady Margaret said, states that when the gentleman is seen, someone in the house dies before the next tide. She folded her hands in her lap with great precision. I am not a superstitious woman, Monsieur Poirot, but I find that I would very much like a rational explanation before the next tide rises. Poirot was silent for a moment. His eyes moved briefly to the faded saints on the ceiling, those vanished faces staring down at nothing from their centuries of dissolution. And then back to Lady Margaret. You shall have one, he said pleasantly. Ghosts, you understand, are most interesting not for what they are, but for what they are being used to conceal. There is someone in this house, my lady, who understands that very well. He reached for a second biscuit. And I, he added, with the quiet satisfaction of a man arranging objects on a shelf, understand it considerably better. Hastings, watching him, recognized the particular brightness in Poirot's small eyes that meant the little grey cells had already begun their work. Outside, the tide was returning. The causeway, he knew, would be gone within the hour. They were on the island for the night. Chapter 2. The inhabitants of a closed-world dinner at Blackthorn Abbey was served at 7:30, by which time the causeway had been entirely swallowed by the sea. Hastings had gone to the window twice to confirm this fact, with the slightly disbelieving air of a man who knows perfectly well that tides are predictable, and yet finds himself unprepared for their indifference to inconvenience. The black water lay flat and featureless in the last of the light. There was no wind now. The island sat in a silence that was not peaceful so much as withheld. Poirot did not go to the window. He had accepted the information about the causeway with a small nod and immediately transferred his attention to the arrangement of objects on the mantelpiece of his room, 2 of which were not symmetrical, and therefore required adjustment before anything else could sensibly be undertaken. The dining room was long, stone-floored, and heated by a fire that was ambitious without being adequate. 7 people sat at the table which had been laid, Hastings observed, with the careful formality of a household that maintained its standards, because to abandon them would be to admit that something had gone very wrong. Lady Margaret presided at the head of the table with the same composed authority she had shown in the drawing-room, though Hastings thought, and he was not always unperceptive about such things, that her composure tonight was work rather than nature. She spoke of the Abbey's history, of the excavations, of a Roman road discovered beneath the causeway some years before, with the fluent ease of a woman who has learned to fill silence before it fills itself. At her right sat her nephew, Arthur Vale. He was perhaps 35, broad-shouldered, with the sunburned look of a man who prefers to be outdoors and resents any circumstance that prevents this. He had his aunt's strong features, but none of her discipline. His face showed what he thought as he thought it, which this evening meant impatience, scepticism, and a particular kind of restlessness that wanted to assert itself, but had not yet found a target it considered worthy. He had shaken Poirot's hand at introduction with the forceful grip of a man making a point, though what point exactly was not immediately clear. "I want it understood," he said, shortly after the soup was served, and before anyone had invited his opinion, "that I consider this entire business a very great deal of nonsense. Mercer died of a heart seizure in a draughty room where he had no business being after dark. The locked door means nothing. Old mechanisms fail. The candle means nothing. And whatever the servants claim to have seen in the corridor is the product of bad lighting and worse nerves." "You may be entirely correct," said Poirot amiably. Arthur Vale looked at him with the expression of a man who had prepared a longer argument and found himself robbed of the occasion for it. Across the table, Miss Clara Finch set down her soup spoon with a small, decisive click. She was perhaps 40, thin-boned, with large dark eyes that moved between speakers with the watchful attention of a woman accustomed to monitoring the emotional weather of a room. She was Lady Margaret's companion, and she had the indefinable quality of someone who has spent years being necessary without being acknowledged, which tends to produce, in certain temperaments, either serenity or a very quiet resentment. In Miss Finch's case, Hastings was not yet certain which. "I know what I saw," she said. She did not raise her voice. "I was not frightened by a draught, Mr. Vale. I was not confused by shadows. I have lived in this house for 11 years, and I know the difference between a dark corridor and a man standing in one." A brief silence descended on the table. "Quite so," said Lady Margaret, in the tone of a woman closing a door. The fourth guest was Dr. Julian Mercer's replacement in the conversation, though not in the archives, a vacancy that seemed to sit at the table as tangibly as the empty chair that had been, Hastings noticed, nevertheless laid with a place-setting. The fifth guest, Mr. Samuel Reed, occupied that chair with the practised unobtrusiveness of a man whose professional skill is to be present without being intrusive. Reed was the estate steward, and he was, Hastings thought, the most immediately unremarkable person he had encountered in some time. He was perhaps 50, of medium height and medium colouring, with a quality of stillness that was not the stillness of inaction, but of a man who has learned to move through the world without disturbing its surface. He spoke when addressed, ate without apparent appetite or enjoyment, and listened to every conversation with an attentiveness that was not quite like ordinary politeness. Poirot spoke to him about the maintenance of the estate. It was the kind of conversation that, in Hastings' experience, meant Poirot was doing something other than having a conversation. "You have been with the family long, Mr. Reed?" 14 years, Monsieur Poirot." "And before that?" "Estate management in Somerset. Before that, various positions." A pause. "I came here when the previous steward retired. Lady Margaret was good enough to take me on. You know the house well, I imagine. Its passages, its, shall we say, idiosyncrasies." "Old houses have a great many of those." Reed refilled his water glass with unhurried precision. "One learns them." Poirot smiled pleasantly and turned to inquire of Lady Margaret whether the storm expected tomorrow was likely to delay his examination of the library. Hastings watched Reed for a moment longer. The man had returned to his meal with perfect equanimity. There was nothing in his expression that could be called defensive, nor anything that could be called revealing. He was, Hastings decided, either entirely innocent or very accomplished indeed. After dinner, Poirot excused himself from the drawing room with the explanation that he wished to look at the library. Not to disturb anything, he assured Lady Margaret, merely to orient himself, and took with him only his small pocket torch and, as Hastings noted, an expression of the most innocent curiosity. The library occupied a section of the original abbey, and the difference in age was immediately apparent. The ceiling was lower here, vaulted in stone rather than plaster, and the walls had absorbed centuries of cold into their very molecular composition. The bookshelves, largely Victorian in their construction, mahogany sensible, seemed almost impertinent intrusions into a space that predated them by 400 years. The stone slab Dr. Mercer had uncovered lay near the centre of the room, where the floorboards had been carefully removed and set to one side. It was large, some 4 feet in length, and bore a carved design that Poirot examined with his torch for quite some time without speaking. The carving was weathered nearly smooth, but the outline of a hand remained visible at one corner, and beneath it, letters in a script older than any Hastings could confidently read. The candle that had burned beside Mercer's body was gone, removed presumably by whoever had attended to the room afterward. But the holder remained sitting on the stone floor beside the slab with a faint ring of wax around its base. Poirot produced a small magnifying glass and crouched, with the resigned expression of a man who is prepared to sacrifice the knees of his trousers in the service of truth. He examined the wax ring. He examined the floor around the slab. He rose, moved to the window, tested the latch, and then stood in perfect stillness for nearly 2 minutes in the centre of the room. "The door," he said at last. Hastings tried it. The lock was old, a heavy iron mechanism, and turned with the grinding reluctance of something that had been forced more than usual. "It was locked from the inside," Hastings said. Lady Margaret confirmed it. They had to force it. "Yes." Poirot directed his torch along the door frame in a methodical sweep. "And yet, you will observe, Hastings, the key is not here. The keyhole is of the old barrel type, quite large. A piece of string, a bent wire, considerable patience, and above all, knowledge of where the key falls when pushed through. It is not the method of a ghost." He extinguished his torch. In the darkness, the sound of the sea became suddenly very present, rising through the floor from the caves below, a grinding rhythmic pressure. "Someone," said Poirot quietly, "has been very careful. But careful people, mon ami, are careful about the things they anticipate being looked for. It is the things they did not anticipate that are so instructive." He moved toward the door with small, deliberate steps. "Tomorrow," he said, "I wish to speak with each member of this household, separately, in the morning, before the storm arrives." He paused at the threshold, "And I wish very much to know where Mr. Reed was on the evening Dr. Mercer died." Behind them the stone slab lay in the torchlight's fading residue, its ancient carved hand reaching upward from the dark, as though asking a question that no one had yet thought to answer. Chapter 3. Something Wakes. The storm arrived before breakfast. Hastings heard it first as a change in the quality of the silence. A low, directional pressure building somewhere beyond the abbey walls. And then, quite suddenly, as something that was not silence at all. Rain struck the bedroom windows in flat, irregular sheets. The wind, which had been absent all the previous evening with the particular ominousness of a held breath, now released itself against the island with a concentrated fury that rattled the old casements in their frames and sent some unidentified object clattering across the courtyard below. He dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Poirot, already seated at the breakfast table, immaculately turned out, eating a boiled egg with the focused attention of a man who considers the proper consumption of breakfast a moral position. A rack of toast stood untouched beside him. He had, apparently, already dismissed it. "The storm," said Poirot without looking up, "will keep the police on the mainland for another day at least. Lady Margaret telegraphed the local constabulary yesterday evening. They cannot cross until the causeway is passable." He tapped the top of his egg with a small spoon. "Which means, Hastings, that whatever is happening in this house continues to happen without official interruption. I find this both inconvenient and clarifying." "Clarifying how?" "Because our murderer knows it also." Hastings helped himself to coffee, which was strong and slightly burnt, and sat down. Through the rain-streaked window, the sea was the colour of old pewter, heaving in long, disorganized swells. The island looked, from this angle, remarkably small. The interviews began at 9:30 in the small study Lady Margaret had made available to Poirot. A room of modest dimensions with a single window overlooking the inner courtyard, a writing desk, 2 chairs, and a portrait of Lord Alistair Vale above the fireplace that Hastings found, once he had noticed it, difficult to stop noticing. The painted lord was lean, dark-eyed, dressed in the evening clothes of the 1880s, and possessed of an expression that managed to suggest both great intelligence and an absolute conviction that the world had not yet understood him properly. He held a candle in the portrait. This detail, given everything, struck Hastings as either deeply ironic or deeply intentional, and he was not certain which possibility was more unsettling. Miss Finch came first. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back very straight, in the manner of a woman who has been told since girlhood that posture communicates character. By daylight and in a smaller room, Hastings revised his initial impression of her. The watchfulness he had noticed at dinner was not anxiety, he decided, but precision. She was a woman who gathered information carefully and spent it sparingly. Poirot asked her to describe, in her own words, what she had seen in the upper corridor on Thursday evening. She did so without dramatics, which Hastings found more convincing than a more theatrical account would have been. She had been returning to her room from the linen cupboard at the far end of the corridor at approximately 9:30. The corridor was lit by 2 electric wall sconces, both of which were, she noted, functioning that evening. She was specific on this point, anticipating the question. The figure she saw was at the far end of the passage, perhaps 40 feet distant, standing quite still. It was tall, slender, dressed in dark evening clothes. It held a candle. The candle flame was the detail she remembered most vividly. Not the figure itself, but the way the flame illuminated the lower portion of its face from beneath, casting the upper features into shadow. "Could you distinguish the face?" Poirot asked. "Not clearly. The light was wrong, but—" She paused, and something shifted in her expression, a small retreat into uncertainty that seemed involuntary rather than evasive. "I had the impression of a long face, a pale face, the kind of face one associates with portraits." Her eyes moved briefly to the painting above the fireplace. "Like that one," she said, and then looked away with the air of someone who wishes they had not said it. Poirot thanked her and asked one further question, almost as an afterthought, in the way he sometimes asked the questions that mattered most. The figure, Miss Finch, when it moved away, which direction did it turn? She thought for a moment. Left, toward the old abbey wing. Not toward the staircase? No, there is no staircase in that direction, only the passage to the west rooms, and beyond that, the old bell tower access. She hesitated. I assumed it went through a wall, which sounds absurd. On the contrary, said Poirot pleasantly. It sounds entirely possible. She left, looking rather less reassured than she had apparently hoped. Arthur Vale came next, and the contrast was immediate. He sat with the sprawling ease of a man asserting territorial rights. Over a chair, his long legs extended, his expression one of preemptive impatience. The ghost, he said, was nonsense. Mercer's death was an unfortunate natural event. The locked door was an old lock, and Mercer had locked it himself from the inside, while alive and in perfectly explicable possession of the key, which had presumably fallen or been knocked somewhere in the subsequent disturbance. He used the word with a brief, uncomfortable pause before it, which Poirot observed without comment. You were fond of Dr. Mercer? Poirot asked. I barely knew the man. He'd been here 6 weeks cataloguing the archives. Aunt Margaret engaged him through some university connection. But you spoke with him. Naturally, one does, at meals in a house this size. He shifted in his chair. He was perfectly agreeable, very enthusiastic about the Abbey history. Rather too enthusiastic, if anything. He had a way of making every discovery sound as though he were the first person in history to notice that old buildings have foundations. Did he speak to you of what he had found beneath the floor? A pause fractionally longer than it needed to be. He mentioned the slab, said there might be a vault. I told him it was probably a drainage channel and changed the subject. Poirot smiled pleasantly. Of course. And on Thursday evening, Mr. Vale, where were you at 9:30? In my room, reading. Alone? One generally reads alone, Monsieur Poirot. One generally does, Poirot agreed. After Vale had gone, Poirot sat for a moment in an uncharacteristic stillness, his eyes fixed on the middle distance in the manner Hastings associated with a particular stage of his thinking. Not the beginning when he asked questions, nor the end when he explained, but the middle passage, when the little grey cells were doing something quiet and structural that produced no visible output. Then, without preamble, the door opened. It was not the next interview. Mrs. Penbury entered without knocking, carrying a small tray with coffee that no one had requested, and set it on the desk with the tranquil authority of a woman who considers the concept of knocking an affectation of the young. She was turning to leave when Poirot spoke. Mrs. Penbury, a moment, if you please. She turned back with neither hurry nor reluctance. You have lived on this island since childhood, I understand. Since I was 7 years old. She folded her hands before her with the patience of someone who has answered questions about this many times and expects to answer them many times more. My mother was housemaid here, her mother before her. Then you know the house as few people can, its sounds, its habits. Poirot's voice was conversational, almost incidental. Its passages. Something moved across Mrs. Penbury's face. Not guilt, Hastings thought, but the specific alertness of a woman who recognizes the shape of a question before it is fully formed. I know it well enough, she said carefully. The passage behind the west wall of the upper corridor, said Poirot, the one that connects to the bell tower access. It is a servant's passage, I think. Very old, older than the Georgian house. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. "It was sealed up," Mrs. Penbury said at last. 30 years ago. There was a problem with damp." "Sealed," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. He let the word settle. "Yes, and yet Miss Finch saw the gentleman turn left, away from all staircases, toward, precisely, the wall behind which that passage runs." Mrs. Penbury said nothing. Her expression had not changed, but she had become, Hastings noticed, entirely still in a way that was different from her previous stillness. This was the stillness of a woman recalibrating. "I think," said Poirot gently, "that the passage is not quite as sealed as one has been led to believe." He poured his coffee. "Thank you, Mrs. Penbury. That will be all for the moment." She left without a word. In the courtyard below, the rain redoubled against the stones, and somewhere deep in the Abbey's bones, a door closed that no one had opened. Or so it seemed. Chapter 4. In the dark, we show our true faces. The electricity failed at 20 minutes past 11. It did not fail dramatically. No sudden plunge, no cry from the rooms above. The lights simply diminished, flickered once with the half-hearted effort of something that knows it is beaten, and went out. The storm had found whatever weakness it required in the line that connected the Abbey's generator to the mainland supply, and the house reverted, without ceremony, to the century it had always more properly belonged to. Mrs. Penbury appeared from the kitchens within 4 minutes carrying a branch of candles, with the unhurried competence of a woman for whom this was not a crisis, but a reversion to the natural order. Additional candlesticks were distributed. The drawing-room acquired a warmth it had lacked under electric light, the kind of warmth that is entirely aesthetic and does nothing whatever for the actual temperature. Poirot accepted his candle and looked at it for a moment with an expression that Hastings could not immediately interpret. Not unease, something more deliberate than that. "How very apposite," he murmured, and said nothing further. The afternoon contracted around the candlelight. Rain continued its assault on the Abbey in shifting waves, and the wind in the old stone passages produced sounds of such varied and organic character that Hastings, who was not an imaginative man by disposition, found himself pausing more than once in doorways to confirm that corridors were empty. They were always empty. This did not somehow entirely settle the matter. It was during this enforced intimacy of storm and candlelight that the house began, as Poirot had perhaps anticipated it would, to show its true interior weather. He found Lady Margaret in the archive room on the ground floor of the Abbey wing. A long, low-ceilinged chamber lined with document cases and smelling powerfully of old paper and something mineral beneath it, the cold exhalation of the stone itself. She was seated at the central table with a leather-bound volume open before her, though when Poirot entered she was not reading it. She was looking at the wall with the fixed attention of a woman pursuing a thought she would rather not have caught. She composed herself immediately with the reflex of long practice. "Monsieur Poirot, I did not hear you." "Old floors," he said pleasantly. "They absorb the step. You are consulting the estate records." "The parish records, actually. Dr. Mercer had been working from this particular volume in the weeks before his death." She glanced down at the open page and then away again, as though the content had already given her something she was still in the process of digesting. "He marked several entries. I was attempting to understand why they interested him." Poirot moved to the table and examined the page without touching it. The entries were in the cramped, economical hand of a Victorian parish clerk. Baptisms, marriages, deaths, property transactions, the administrative sediment of a community's life. Several lines had been marked with pencil in the margin. Not underlined, Hastings noticed, looking over Poirot's shoulder, bracketed, as though Mercer had wanted to contain something rather than merely emphasize it. The bracketed entry was a property transfer, dated 1667. The names were old, the legal language dense, the terminology of conveyance unfamiliar. But the surnames were clear enough. One of them was Vale, the other was Reed. Poirot straightened. His face was arranged in the expression of polite interest he deployed when something had confirmed rather than surprised him, which meant it conveyed rather less than it appeared to. "Lady Margaret," he said with some care, "how much do you know of the original acquisition of this estate by your family?" A silence fell that was different in quality from the silences that had preceded it. Outside, a gust struck the abbey walls, hard enough to make the candle flames bow sideways in unison. And in that moment of bowed light, Lady Margaret's composure showed its first genuine fracture. Not a collapse, nothing so dramatic, but the fine line crack of a well-maintained surface under unexpected pressure. "Very little," she said. "Only that it has been in the Vale family for 350 years. The manner of its acquisition does not appear in the family history?" "The family history," she said with a dryness that was not quite bitterness, "was written by a Vale for Vales. Such documents tend toward selectivity." She closed the parish record with a careful, definitive movement. "You believe the transfer was improper?" "I believe Dr. Mercer believes so, and I believe that is what he found beneath the floor of the library. Evidence old enough and specific enough to be significant. Whether it retains legal force after 3.5 centuries is a matter for solicitors." Poirot paused. "What concerns me rather more immediately is who else knew what Mercer had found." Lady Margaret met his eyes steadily. "You are asking whether I knew." "I am asking everyone everything, my lady. It is my method, inefficient in appearance, I grant you, but reliable in its results." "I did not know." She said it without emphasis, which was, Poirot had long observed, the register in which truth most commonly presents itself. "Julian Mercer was a careful man. He would not have brought me an incomplete theory. He was building toward something, and he was not ready." A pause. "He was excited in the last week. I noticed it. I assumed it was the archaeologist's ordinary enthusiasm for what lay beneath the next layer of earth." Her voice did not change, but something behind it did. "I should have asked him, directly." Poirot said gently, "We are all the historians of our own inaction, my lady. It is the least forgiving genre." He left her with the parish record and went in search of Samuel Reed. He found him, after some 20 minutes, in the most logical place. Which was to say, the place Poirot had checked last, having elected to establish first where Reed was not. The estate office was a small, functional room near the back of the house, its shelves lined with ledgers and maintenance logs, its single window admitting a grey, rain-filtered light that fell across the desk in a way that illuminated Reed's hands rather than his face. He was writing when Poirot entered, and he finished the sentence he was on before looking up. This too, Poirot reflected, was characteristic. "Monsieur Poirot, is there something I can do for you?" The inquiry was perfectly calibrated, neither welcoming nor discouraging. It was the tone of a man who has spent years being helpful on precisely his own terms. Poirot sat down in the chair opposite without being invited. "I have been examining the parish records with Lady Margaret," he said conversationally. "A property transfer of 1667 caught my attention. The names Vale and Reed appear in the same document. A coincidence that interests me." Reed set down his pen. The movement was unhurried, but it was, Hastings thought from his position in the doorway, the first time the man had done anything in their presence that required the conscious suppression of an impulse. He had set the pen down rather than placed it. "It is not a coincidence," Reed said. "No," said Poirot. "I rather thought it was not." Another silence, different again from the others. This one with weight in it, the weight of something that has been carried for a long time, and is deciding whether the moment to set it down has arrived. "My family farmed this island for 200 years before the Vales acquired it," Reed said at last. The even tone held, but underneath it something older and harder was briefly audible. "The transfer was not a sale. The records Dr. Mercer found, which I have known about since I was a boy, from my grandmother's papers, make that clear enough. It was a forgery, a Vale with a lawyer's education and a dishonest imagination, and a Reed family with no recourse and no money for courts." He looked at Poirot with eyes that were, for the first time, entirely unguarded. "My grandmother told me this house was ours by right. She told me every year until she died." Poirot regarded him without expression for a long moment. "And you came to work here," he said quietly, 14 years ago. "I came to learn what could still be proved." Outside, the storm pressed itself against the Abbey with renewed insistence, and in the passage beyond the estate office, a candlestick guttered and went briefly dark, as though the house were listening and had heard quite enough. "Mr. Reed," said Poirot, and his voice had changed. Not harder, but more precise, the way a good blade is precise rather than forceful. "I must ask you plainly. On the evening Dr. Mercer died, where were you?" Reed looked at him steadily across the desk. "I was in the west passage," he said. "The one behind the upper corridor wall." He picked up his pen and did not elaborate. Chapter 5. The history beneath the legend Reed did not elaborate, and Poirot did not press him. This was not, Hastings reflected afterward, what he had expected. He had anticipated the next 20 minutes to involve the kind of direct, sustained questioning that Poirot occasionally deployed when a conversation had arrived at its essential point. The quiet insistence, the careful restatement, the patient application of logic until the defensive structure of an explanation gave way at its weakest join. Instead, Poirot had simply risen from his chair, thanked Reed with every appearance of satisfaction, and withdrawn. In the passage, outside, Hastings kept his voice low. "You're not going to ask him what he was doing in there?" "I know what he was doing in there." Poirot moved along the corridor with his hands clasped behind his back, his steps precise and unhurried on the uneven flagstones. "He was wearing a costume, Hastings. He was carrying a candle. He was, in the parlance of the theatrical profession, performing." A pause. "What I do not yet know is the precise sequence of what followed. And a man who has admitted the lesser thing while withholding the greater is not yet ready to surrender the greater. To press him now would be to receive a prepared answer. I prefer, for the moment, the unprepared ones. And if he destroys evidence in the meanwhile." Poirot glanced at him with the expression he reserved for observations that were sensible, but slightly behind events. "The evidence that matters," he said, "is in the parish records, in the construction of the West Passage. in the chemical composition of certain powders and in the minds of 6 people currently confined to this island by the action of tides and weather. None of these things can be destroyed between now and dinner. He turned left toward the Abbey wing. Come, I wish to examine the bell tower. The bell tower access was reached through a low door at the far end of the west corridor, precisely where Miss Finch had indicated the ghost had turned, and where the panelled wall concealed. Poirot had now confirmed from a study of the original Abbey plans he had located that morning in the archive room, the entrance to the old servants' passage. The panel moved when he applied pressure to its lower left corner with the ease of something that has been used recently, though it bore on its outer face the convincing dustiness of long disuse. Poirot examined the dust distribution with his magnifying glass and said, with quiet pleasure, "Brushed on, quite professionally done. Rabbit hair brush, I should think, for the delicacy of the application. Our Mr. Reed is a thorough man." Beyond the panel, the passage was narrow, low-ceilinged, and utterly dark. Poirot's torch revealed stone walls worn smooth by generations of servants who had moved through this artery of the house unseen, carrying coals and linens and the invisible labour that kept great houses operational. The floor was thick with genuine dust here, decades of it undisturbed except for 2 clear sets of footprints that ran the length of the passage and back. One set had been made in ordinary shoes. The other had been made in shoes coated with something that had left a faintly luminous residue on the stone where the torchlight caught it at an angle. Phosphorescent powder. 2 separate occasions, Poirot said, playing the torch across the floor with methodical attention. The first set of prints, those in ordinary shoes, made some time ago. Weeks perhaps, when Reed first reopened the passage and assessed its utility. The luminous prints are more recent. They were made on the night of the performance. He straightened and directed the torch beam forward. Shall we follow them? The passage ran the full length of the west wing and terminated, as the Abbey plans had indicated, in a short staircase rising to the bell tower. But midway along its length, Hastings noticed what Poirot had already seen. A section of wall where the stone had been altered. A narrow aperture, perhaps 18 inches across, with hinges of recent manufacture and a wooden frame fitted with such precision that the join was nearly invisible from the passage side. Poirot opened it. It gave onto the upper corridor of the main house, 3 feet from the wall sconce nearest to the east staircase. From here, a figure emerging would be visible the full length of the corridor. From here, a figure carrying a candle and dressed in the evening clothes of 6 decades past would be exactly what Miss Finch had seen. At sufficient distance for detail to be lost, in the wrong quality of light for certainty, with no rational point of entry or exit visible to a watching eye. "Elementary stagecraft," said Poirot, not unkindly. "The conjurer's first principle. The audience looks at the hand that moves. They do not look at the wall." He pulled the aperture closed and continued toward the bell tower. At its base they found what the outline of the haunting had promised. A mechanism of considerable ingenuity bolted to the original stone of the tower walls. A rope, newly replaced but threaded through a pulley system of some antiquity, connected via a length of thin wire to a bracket mounted in the exterior wall, positioned to catch the wind above a certain velocity. When the wind reached sufficient force, the wire pulled, the rope moved, and any loose bell frame hardware above would swing and strike. It would not produce the clear peal of a functioning bell, but at night in a storm. Filtered through 300 years of stone, it would produce precisely the effect the household had described. A violent, sourceless ringing from a tower that had no bell. Hastings examined it with frank admiration that he was not entirely sure was appropriate. He built all of this. Over 14 years, Poirot said. He did not rush. He prepared his materials, learned the house, identified its structural possibilities, and waited until he had both the motive and the means fully assembled. He ran his gloved finger along the wire where it met the bracket. Dr. Mercer's arrival was not anticipated in the original design, I think. Mercer was an acceleration, a man who had independently arrived at the same historical truth Reed had spent his life accumulating, and who would make it public through academic channels before Reed was ready to use it. Reed needed Mercer silenced, and he needed the household too frightened by the legend to look closely at what Mercer had found. So he killed him. Poirot was quiet for a moment. Below them, through the tower's narrow window slit, the sea was visible. A churned, colourless expanse beneath a sky of identical tone, the horizon entirely dissolved. The island in a storm had a quality of absolute severance from the world that Hastings found, despite himself, deeply oppressive. He created the circumstances in which Mercer could be killed, Poirot said carefully. The ghost was seen that Thursday evening. The household's attention was directed upward, toward corridors and legends, away from the library. Mercer was in the library. The west passage runs within 3 feet of the library's interior wall. He turned away from the window. Whether Reed went through an aperture he had not yet cut, or whether there is a third entrance to that library we have not yet found, remains to be established. But the locked room is not, in the end, the central mystery. It is merely the last effect in a very long performance. What is the central mystery, then? Poirot began to descend the tower stairs with the careful tread of a man navigating uneven stone in good shoes. The central mystery, he said, is whether Samuel Reed considers what he has done to be murder or justice. They are not, you understand, the same thing. And which answer he gives, even only to himself, will determine everything about what happens next. A pause on the stair. He admitted his presence in that passage with great calm, Hastings. A guilty man in panic does not do that. A man who has spent 14 years constructing a moral argument does. They emerged from the tower door into the west corridor. The candles in the wall sconces made the shadows move as they passed. From the far end of the passage, quite distinctly, came the sound of the drawing-room door opening, and then, a moment later, Arthur Vale's voice raised in anger. The specific, unmodulated anger of a man who has just been told something he cannot immediately disprove. Poirot and... Hastings looked at one another. They walked rather quickly toward the sound. Chapter 6. The Emotional Abyss. Arthur Vale was standing at the centre of the drawing-room with the posture of a man who has entered a space intending to dominate it, and found, to his considerable displeasure, that the space declines to be dominated. Lady Margaret sat in the chair nearest the fire. She had not moved, Hastings guessed, since Vale had begun speaking. She had the stillness of someone who has decided that movement would be interpreted as retreat. Miss Finch occupied the window seat with her hands pressed flat against the cushion on either side of her, as though the upholstery might require steadying. Reed was not present. Vale turned as Poirot and Hastings entered. You. He pointed at Poirot with the unself-conscious directness of a man past the point of social calibration. I want to know what you've told her. I have told Lady Margaret only what the parish records contain, Poirot said mildly, settling himself into the chair nearest the door with the air of a man arriving at a theatrical performance that is already underway. Which is to say, a property transfer of 1667, which appears to be fraudulent in its execution. This is a historical matter and a legal one. It is not, in the first instance, a criminal one. Not criminal. Vale laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound. A man is dead, Monsieur Poirot. Our steward has been creeping around in the walls dressed as a ghost from my family's history. And you describe it as a historical matter. The murder of Dr. Mercer is emphatically criminal, Poirot agreed. I was referring to the question of the estate's original acquisition. The two things are connected, but they are not the same thing, and it would be a considerable error to treat them as though they were. Vale stared at him. The anger was still present, but it had shifted in quality. It was no longer the uncomplicated outrage of a man affronted, but something more complicated and less comfortable. Hastings recognized it after a moment as the particular fury of a person who has spent their life in confident possession of something they are now being asked to examine. My family has held this estate for 350 years, Vale said. The declaration arrived with less force than it had apparently set out with. Yes, said Poirot. And the manner of its original acquisition is a question for courts and historians. What concerns me, Mr. Vale, is rather more immediate. He looked at Vale steadily. When did you first learn of the passage behind the west corridor wall? The question landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples moving outward to touch every face in turn. Vale sat down. It was not a graceful movement. He sat the way men sit when their legs have made a decision before their pride has agreed to it. I've always known about it, he said, after a pause that was precisely one beat too long. It's in the original house plans. I looked at them years ago when I first started spending time here after my uncle died, and Aunt Margaret took on the estate. He looked at the fire rather than at Poirot. I assumed it was sealed permanently. You did not know Reed had reopened it. Of course I did not know. The anger reasserted itself, more sharply now, and Hastings had the distinct impression that it was directed inward as much as outward. If I had known that our steward was using the walls of this house as his personal theatre, I would have... He stopped. Yes, said Poirot pleasantly. Vale said nothing. Into this silence, with the timing of someone who has waited with great patience for precisely this moment, Miss Finch spoke from the window seat. Arthur knew about the passage, she said. Her voice was quite steady. He knew it had been reopened. I saw him coming out of the panel entrance 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday afternoon, before the ghost was first seen, before Dr. Mercer found the slab. She looked at Vale with the expression of a woman releasing something she has carried carefully for a considerable distance. I said nothing at the time because I did not understand what it meant. I understand now. The fire crackled. Lady Margaret had not moved, but her eyes, which had been fixed on the middle distance throughout, now settled on her nephew with an expression that Hastings found, in the circumstances, rather terrible in its quietness. Vale did not look at his aunt. He looked at Miss Finch with something that was almost beneath its fury, a species of relief. The particular relief of a person whose secret has been too heavy to carry alone for too long. "I went in to look," he said finally. "Nothing more than that. Reed had left the panel slightly ajar one evening. I noticed it. I looked inside. I saw what he had built." A pause. The costume, the mirrors, the mechanism on the bell tower. "And you said nothing," Poirot said. "I said nothing." Vale's jaw tightened. Because the ghost was keeping people away from the library. Mercer had been talking at dinner about what he thought he'd find under that floor. I had read enough of my family's history to have a general sense of what might be down there, and I thought... He stopped again, more completely this time. "You thought," Poirot said with no particular inflection, "that a house emptied by fear was preferable to a library opened by inquiry." The silence that followed was of a different order entirely. It had the quality of a thing fully named, which cannot subsequently be unnamed. "I did not know he was going to kill anyone," Vale said. The words came out with the flat, effortful precision of a man laying down something he can no longer hold at arm's length. "I thought he was frightening people away from the library. I thought that served my interests well enough." His voice dropped. "I did not know what Reed intended. For Mercer." Poirot looked at him for a long moment. It was not a kind look, nor a harsh one. It was the look of a man taking a precise measurement. "No," he said at last. "I do not believe you did." He rose from his chair. "Which makes you, Mr. Vale, neither innocent nor guilty in the ordinary sense, but rather something more difficult to categorize. A man who chose convenience over conscience and found that others were willing to travel rather further down that road than he had anticipated." He moved toward the door. "It is an uncomfortable position. I recommend you consider it carefully before the police arrive." He paused at the threshold and turned back, not to Vale but to Lady Margaret, who had maintained throughout the exchange the same quality of absolute stillness. "My lady, I should like this evening to examine the stone slab in the library once more. There is a detail of the carving I did not properly attend to on my first visit. I believe it may tell us where, precisely, the documents that Mercer found are now." Lady Margaret looked at him. "You think they still exist?" "I think Reed would not have committed murder to prevent their discovery and then destroyed them." Poirot's voice was measured. "He needed the estate's illegal acquisition proved. He needs those documents rather more urgently than anyone in this room, and for reasons which, however we judge his methods, are not entirely without foundation in historical justice." He turned the door handle. "Which is, of course, precisely what makes this case so very disagreeable." He went out. Hastings followed, and behind them the drawing-room settled back into its silence. A silence now populated by the various wreckages of what had just been said, each person in the room left alone with their particular portion of it. In the corridor, Hastings fell into step beside Poirot. "Vale knew," he said, still somewhat stunned by the speed of it. "Vale suspected," Poirot corrected him, without slowing his pace. "There is a moral distinction, though I confess at this proximity it is not a wide one." He clasped his hands behind his back. "The interesting question, however, is not what Arthur Vale knew. It is what Reed knew that Arthur Vale knew." Hastings considered this for several steps. "You think Reed was aware Vale had seen the passage?" "I think," said Poirot, "that a man who spends 14 years studying a house studies also the people in it. And I think that Reed, who missed nothing and prepared for everything, built into his performance a quality of misdirection, aimed not only at the frightened and the credulous, but specifically at the one person in this house who knew the ghost was a fiction and chose, for his own reasons, to let it continue. A pause. That is a very particular kind of blackmail, Hastings. Not the financial kind, the moral kind, the kind that binds a man with his own worst choices rather than with threats. The library door was at the end of the passage, its iron handle cold beneath Hastings's palm. Somewhere above them, inaudible beneath the storm's steady pressure, the wind found the wire on the tower wall, and the old rope in the pulley shifted just once, just slightly, like a thought that had not quite completed itself. Poirot opened the library door and went in without hesitation. Chapter 7. The Ghost Unmasked. The stone slab by candlelight was a different thing entirely. Hastings had seen it first in the beam of Poirot's electric torch. A flat grey rectangle of considerable age, its carved surface so eroded by time and damp that the design had seemed merely decorative, a pattern of worn grooves from which any particular meaning had long since departed. By candlelight, with the flame held low and at an angle, the shadows fell differently. What had appeared to be abstract ornamentation resolved itself, gradually, and then quite suddenly, into legible form. It was a hand, not one hand, as Hastings had noted before, but two, a right hand and a left, pressed palm to palm in the ancient gesture of fealty, of one man pledging himself to another. Beneath them, the letters were not ornamental at all. They were a name. Reed. Poirot held his candle very still and said nothing for a long moment. A grave marker, Hastings said quietly. Not precisely. Poirot passed the candle to Hastings and produced his magnifying glass. He worked along the slab's perimeter in the methodical, unhurried fashion of a man who has learned that the important things are almost always at the edges. At the slab's lower right corner, he stopped. "Here, you see it?" Hastings crouched, cut into the stone at the corner, in much finer and more recent work than the carved hands. Recent meaning, perhaps, a century rather than 3, was a small symbol. A compass rose, 8-pointed, the cardinal directions marked. And at the centre of the rose, a depression in the stone, circular, no larger than a coin. "A marker of a different kind," Poirot said. He stood and looked about the room with the systematic attention he gave to any space that had recently revealed something unexpected. The bookshelves, the walls, the floor. His gaze settled on the fireplace, a deep, plain stone fireplace built, from its construction, directly into the original abbey wall. He crossed to it and examined the hearthstone. The hearthstone was loose. It required no tools to lift, only the knowledge that it would lift, and a firm grip on its near edge. Beneath it, in a cavity that had been cut into the foundation stone below, with the patient craft of someone who had a great deal of time and a great deal to protect, lay a leather satchel. The leather was dark with age, but had been treated regularly with oil. It was supple rather than cracked, preserved with the deliberate care of a custodian rather than hidden with the haste of a fugitive. Poirot did not open it. He looked at it for a moment with an expression that was, Hastings thought, rather more complex than simple satisfaction. Something in it that acknowledged the satchel's long patience, the decades it had spent beneath the feet of people who did not know what they were standing on. "Mercer found this," Hastings said. "Mercer found the slab, and the compass rose, and understood their implication. he would have lifted the hearthstone that evening. Poirot replaced the hearthstone carefully, leaving the satchel where it lay. He was not killed before he could look. He was killed after. Reed could not risk what Mercer might do with what he had seen. He straightened. The documents are the proof of everything Reed claims. They are also, at this moment, the most dangerous objects in this house, not because of what they reveal about the past, but because of what they might tempt Reed to do in the present. You think he'll try to take them? I think he already knows precisely where they are. He has known for 14 years. He did not hide them here. They have been here for a century at least, preserved by some Reed ancestor who understood that proof requires safekeeping, not destruction. Poirot picked up his candle. What I think is that Reed has been waiting, with very great patience, for the right moment to produce them through proper channels. And I think that Dr. Mercer's death and the arrival of the police tomorrow has made that moment both more urgent and considerably more complicated than Reed had intended. He moved toward the library door, then stopped. In the corridor outside, someone was walking with the particular quality of carefulness that distinguishes a person trying not to be heard from a person simply moving quietly. The footsteps were measured, deliberate, heading toward the library from the direction of the west passage entrance. Poirot blew out his candle. The darkness was immediate and absolute. The library's sealed windows admitted no outside light, and the absence of the single flame was total. Hastings stood very still. He heard his own breathing and Poirot's complete absence of it, and the footsteps in the corridor arriving at the library door, and then the door opening. A figure entered carrying a shielded lantern. The lantern cast a low, directed light that illuminated the floor in a narrow path. The figure moved directly to the fireplace with the certainty of prior knowledge, crouched, and set both hands to the hearthstone's edge. Poirot struck a match. Samuel Reed looked up from his crouch at the hearthstone and met Poirot's eyes across the 6 feet of library floor that separated them. His expression in the match's small, wavering light was not the expression of a man caught. It was the expression of a man who had considered this possibility and made his peace with it. "Monsieur Poirot," he said. He did not stand. "Mr. Reed." Poirot lit the candle from the match with the unhurried ease of a man performing a familiar action. "The documents are quite safe where they are. I have not moved them. I shall not move them. They will be available to whatever legal process follows, and they will say what they say." He set the candlestick on the library table. "I should be grateful if you would leave them where they are." Reed looked at him for a long moment. Then, with the deliberate movement of a man reversing a decision he has carried for some distance, he withdrew his hands from the hearthstone and stood. "You already knew," Reed said. It was not quite an accusation. "I deduced the hearthstone this evening from the compass rose. You have known since you arrived here 14 years ago." Poirot's voice was without judgment, which was, Hastings had noticed, where it became most precise. "I think the documents were shown to you before you came. By your grandmother, perhaps, or by her records. You came to this house knowing what lay beneath the floor, knowing what the slab marked, knowing where the proof was kept. Everything that followed was built upon that knowledge." "Everything," Reed said, "was built upon 350 years of a theft that was never answered for. The evenness held, but it held the way ice holds. The support was there, but the tension of it was audible. I did not come here to frighten old women or manufacture ghosts for amusement, Monsieur Poirot. I came to reclaim something that was taken. Mercer was going to publish his findings through academic journals, pass the documents to a university archive, turn my family's stolen birthright into a scholarly footnote. Something moved through his voice that was the closest he had come, in Hastings' observation, to rawness. I could not allow that. No, said Poirot quietly. I see that you could not. He paused. What you did to Dr. Mercer, you will tell me now precisely what occurred in this room. Reed looked at the slab on the floor, its carved hands just visible in the candlelight. He did not suffer, Reed said. That is not what I asked. Another silence. Then Reed sat down on the stone slab itself, on the very marker of his ancestors' occupation of this land, with the weariness of a man at the end of a very long walk, and began to speak. Hastings listened. Poirot listened with his eyes half closed, in the manner of someone for whom listening is an instrument rather than a passive act. The candle burned steadily between them. Outside, quite without announcement, the storm stopped. The silence it left behind was the deep, washed silence of an island that had forgotten, briefly, how to make a sound. And in that silence Reed's voice continued level and precise, dismantling the last of the architecture he had spent 14 years constructing, brick by careful brick, until all that remained was the truth, plain, unglamorous, and irrevocably his. Chapter 8. Poirot's Trap. Reed's confession, when it came, was not what Hastings had expected. There was no drama to it, no sudden unburdening, no collapse into remorse, no theatrical revelation of the kind that Hastings had come to associate, through long acquaintance with Poirot's cases, with the moment a guilty man finally speaks. Reed sat on the stone slab and spoke in the same measured, unhurried tone he brought to estate ledgers and maintenance schedules, as though the murder of Julian Mercer were a transaction requiring accurate documentation rather than a crime requiring confession. That, Hastings thought, was perhaps the most disturbing thing about it. On the Thursday evening, Reed had been in the West Passage, costumed, prepared to perform the gentleman's second appearance. The first, 3 nights earlier, had achieved its intended effect with satisfying precision. Miss Finch had been suitably affected, Mrs. Penbury confirmed in her beliefs, the household's attention directed firmly upward and away from the library floor. The second appearance was intended to consolidate the fear, to ensure that no one approached the library while Mercer worked, to buy the time Reed needed. Instead, emerging from the aperture into the corridor, he had seen lamplight beneath the library door that should not have been there. Mercer was working late. More significantly, the sound from inside the library had not been the sound of careful excavation. It had been the sound of something found. The particular silence of a man who has stopped moving because he no longer needs to. Reed had gone to the library through the third entrance, which Poirot had correctly surmised existed. A connecting door, concealed behind a run of shelving in the Abbey wall, its existence noted in the original construction plans, and its concealment arranged by Reed himself in the first months of his tenure, 14 years ago, against precisely this necessity. Mercer had the hearthstone raised. He had the satchel open on the library table. He was reading, with the absorbed intensity of a scholar encountering primary evidence of the first order, entirely unaware that the door behind the shelving had opened. "What did you say to him?" Poirot asked. Reed's pause was brief. "I told him what the documents proved. I told him what I intended." "And what did he say?" He said the documents belonged to history. Reed's voice remained level, but something in it had become very flat, like a body of water, with all the wind gone off it. He said his obligation was to the historical record, that private inheritance claims were a matter for solicitors, not academics, that he could not suppress a primary source of that significance on the basis of a steward's family grievance. Another pause. He used that word, grievance. Poirot said nothing. I had waited 14 years, Reed said. My grandmother waited 60. Her mother before that. He looked at his hands, which were resting with great stillness on his knees. 350 years of people being told that what was taken from them was, in the formal sense, no longer theirs, that the mechanisms of law had made the theft permanent. That time itself had ratified a forgery. He looked up. I could not let him walk out of this room with those documents and bury them in a university archive where they would become a footnote in a paper no one would read. So you killed him, Hastings said. It came out more flatly than he had intended. Reed looked at him with neither resentment nor surprise. His heart was not strong. The house physician had remarked on it at dinner the previous month. I heard him tell Lady Margaret. I knew that. I used what I knew. He returned his gaze to Poirot. I frightened him badly, very suddenly, in a dark room. His own heart did the rest. I held him as he fell, and I laid him down carefully, and I lit the candle from the mechanism I had prepared in the library for the third appearance. The one I did not now need to make, because the deed was already done. He paused. I locked the door from inside using the shelf passage. I left the key where it would eventually be found beneath the slab. The room was very still. The candle, Poirot said, was paraffin, not the household beeswax, a detail that should not exist if the scene were entirely natural. I know, Reed said. I realized it afterward. The wrong candle was in my pocket. By then it was too late. Poirot was quiet for a moment. In that quiet, Hastings became gradually aware of the changed quality of the island's atmosphere. The absence of wind, the absence of rain, the first suggestion beyond the library's sealed windows that the night sky had somewhere above the clouds preserved a few stars in working order. You will tell all of this, Poirot said, to the police, tomorrow, when the causeway is passable. Yes, said Reed. It was said without hesitation and without performance, which was, Hastings reflected, consistent with everything else about the man. He had constructed an elaborate deception for 14 years and delivered it with the patience and discipline of a craftsman. The abandonment of it, when the time came, he appeared to approach with the same quality of decision. One question remains, Poirot said. He sat down on the chair nearest the table and regarded Reed with the look of a man who has arrived at the final accounting and wishes to be certain the figures are correct. The night I arrived, the corridor outside the chapel, the cold and the candle that bent in still air. He tilted his head very slightly. Was that you? Reed looked at him for a long moment. No, he said. Poirot studied him with the full, undeflected attention he reserved for statements he intended to believe and wished to verify. Reed met it without flinching. No, Poirot said at last, as though confirming something to himself rather than to Reed. I see. He rose. You will remain in your room tonight, Mr. Reed, and you will not attempt to leave this island. I think you know there is nowhere to go, and I think, in any case, that you have no intention of trying. He picked up his candle. We will speak again in the morning. Reed nodded once. He did not move from the slab. In the corridor, Hastings waited until the library door was fully closed before turning to Poirot. "He said no," he said, keeping his voice low. "About the corridor? You believe him?" "I believe him about the corridor," Poirot said, "precisely because he lied about nothing else." He began to walk toward the staircase with his candle held forward, the flames steady in the post-storm stillness of the passage. A man who confesses to murder without equivocation has very little reason to deny an insignificant draught. Then what was it? Poirot paused at the foot of the stairs. The flame threw his shadow up the wall, large, attenuated, an altogether less precise version of himself. "Old buildings breathe, Hastings," he said. "They expand and contract with temperature. Passages that have been sealed for decades, when suddenly reopened, redistribute air in ways that are perfectly explicable by the ordinary laws of physics." He began to climb. The cold was the passage behind the wall, disturbed by Reed's recent use, expressing itself through microscopic gaps in the stonework. The candle bent because the air pressure in the corridor changed, briefly, slightly, when Reed, in his passage, moved from one section to another. Hastings climbed behind him. "You've worked that out only now." "I worked it out on the first evening," Poirot said. "I simply chose, in the interests of intellectual honesty, to leave the question open until I had the evidence to close it cleanly." A pause on the stair. "One should not explain away things one cannot yet fully explain. It is a temptation of the untidy mind." They reached the landing. The corridor stretched away in both directions. The wall sconces dark. The only light there too. Candles burning in the silence of an island that had stopped performing and returned to merely being itself. Poirot looked at his candle flame for a moment. Steady, small, mundane in its orange simplicity. "Tomorrow," he said. "The tide will be low at 7:30. The police will arrive by 9. I shall ask them to bring a solicitor as well as handcuffs. The documents in the hearthstone will require both." He turned toward his room. "Sleep well, Hastings. There is nothing further tonight that the little grey cells can usefully do." He closed his door. Hastings stood for a moment in the dark corridor, candle in hand, listening to the island settle around him. The soft percussion of cooling stone, the distant whisper of the retreated sea, the creak of old timber finding its resting position after the storm's long agitation. All of it entirely explicable. All of it, in the dark and the silence, still faintly, stubbornly alive. Chapter 9. Daylight kills all ghosts thee. Morning arrived without apology. After 2 days of storm, the sky above Blackthorn Abbey had resolved itself into a clear, indifferent blue that made the previous weather seem not so much past as discredited. The sea lay calm and silver to the horizon. The causeway reappeared at 7:30 exactly, emerging from the retreating water with the stolid reliability of something that has never found dramatic timing particularly interesting. Poirot was already dressed when Hastings knocked at his door at 8. He had, he informed Hastings with some satisfaction, slept excellently. This was characteristic. Hastings, who had slept poorly, and at one point been briefly convinced by a settling timber that the gentleman had returned, chose not to share the comparison. Breakfast was taken in almost complete silence. The household assembled at the table as if by prior arrangement, each person occupying their usual chair by the force of habit in the absence of any stronger principle to guide them. Reed was present, which Hastings had not entirely expected. He ate with his usual absence of apparent appetite and spoke to no one. Miss Finch studied her teacup. Arthur Vale looked out the window at the causeway with the expression of a man calculating distances. Lady Margaret poured tea with the precision and care she brought to everything, which this morning struck Hastings as less composure than determination. At 9:05, the sound of a motor car on the causeway ended whatever remained of the night's particular quality of suspended time. Poirot rose first. "I should be grateful," he said, addressing the table generally, "if everyone would remain in the drawing-room after breakfast. I have a small matter of explanation to conduct before the inspector arrives, and I prefer to conduct it once rather than 6 times." He said this with the pleasantness of a man making a perfectly reasonable request. Nobody considered refusing it. The drawing-room had been arranged, Hastings noticed, in the night's interval between Reed's confession and morning. Every curtain had been drawn fully open. The October light came in at a low, clean angle, stripping the room of the amber shadows that candlelight had deposited over the previous 2 days. The faded saints on the ceiling were visible again in their full, pale vacancy, their outlines barely there, their eyes long dissolved. In daylight, they looked less like presences than like the memory of presences. Evidence that something had once believed in something, which was an altogether different matter. Poirot stood before the fireplace. He did not pace, did not produce objects from his pockets or gesture towards exhibits. He simply stood with his hands lightly clasped before him and spoke in the way that he sometimes did at these moments, as though he were thinking aloud and the assembled household were present by courteous invitation rather than necessity. "The haunting of Blackthorn Abbey," he began, "rested upon 2 foundations. The first was theatrical, mirrors placed at corridor junctions to project an image from an unexpected angle, phosphorescent powder on the costume to catch candlelight and produce an unearthly luminosity, a wind mechanism in the bell tower to create sound without apparent source. These were the instruments. They were well chosen and well executed." He paused. "The second foundation was psychological, and it was considerably more sophisticated. Mr. Reed understood, from 14 years of close observation, that this household did not require much persuasion to believe in the gentleman. The legend was already resident in the house. It needed only to be activated. Mrs. Penbury believed because she had always believed. Miss Finch believed because she is a woman of strong feeling in whom imagination precedes investigation. Lady Margaret did not quite believe but feared, which for the purposes of the haunting was entirely sufficient. And Mr. Arthur Vale. He looked at Vale directly, without emphasis but without deflection. Mr. Vale did not believe at all. He knew, and he said nothing, because the ghost that frightened others served his interests, and the death of Dr. Mercer, which he did not commission and did not foresee, served them still further. He is not a murderer, but he is a man who allowed a murder to become useful to him, and that particular moral position is one that will require very careful legal attention. Vale had gone quite white. He did not speak. "The mechanism of the locked room," Poirot continued, "was as follows. A concealed connecting door in the abbey wall behind the east bookshelf connected the library to the servants' passage. Reed entered through this door, encountered Dr. Mercer in possession of the documents, and induced cardiac arrest through deliberate, severe fright delivered in darkness. He then locked the library's main door from the inside using the original key, withdrew through the connecting door, and allowed the scene to arrange itself. He paused. The key was subsequently located beneath the stone slab by the first person to look carefully enough, which in this household was myself. From the doorway, a knock, and the sound of the housekeeper's voice announced the inspector's arrival. Poirot held up one small hand. One moment more. He turned to Lady Margaret, and his voice, which had been even throughout, took on the particular quality of care that he reserved for things requiring it. My lady, the documents in the hearthstone of this library are genuine. They are old, and their legal weight after 3.5 centuries is a matter for courts to determine, and courts will take their time about it, as courts invariably do. What they establish beyond question is that the original transfer of this estate from the Reed family to your ancestors was fraudulent in its execution. What consequences follow from that establishment is not for me to say. Lady Margaret looked at him steadily. You think I should have known? I think the past does not require your personal endorsement in order to have occurred. He met her eyes. What you do with the knowledge, now that it is yours, is entirely your own matter. I observe only that the most durable resolutions to these questions are generally arrived at by the people involved rather than by courts, who understand law, but not, in the main, the particular texture of individual conscience. She said nothing, but something in her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The finest adjustment of a position long held against significant internal pressure. Poirot gave a small nod and turned toward the door. Now, the inspector. Inspector Cromer of the Devon Constabulary was a broad, capable man of 50 who had the professionally unhurried manner of someone who has seen sufficient human disorder to have ceased being surprised by any of its specific configurations. He listened to Poirot's summary with the concentrated attention of a man taking mental notes, asked 6 precise questions, and directed his sergeant to take Reed into custody with a brevity that stripped the moment of whatever residual drama it might have carried. Reed stood without assistance and went without resistance. At the drawing-room door he paused and looked back. Not at Lady Margaret, not at Vale, but at the room itself. The light coming through the open curtains, the ceiling with its dissolved saints, the stone fireplace and its unremarkable hearthstone. My grandmother used to say, he told the room, with the flat, final quality of a man delivering the last sentence of something very long, that the house would remember, that it always remembers. He looked at Poirot. She was right, wasn't she, in the end? In the end, Poirot said, the house remembered nothing. A man remembered. There is considerable difference, though I understand why your grandmother found the larger version more sustaining. He paused. I am sorry for the manner of your life, Mr. Reed. I am not sorry for the ending of it, in this particular respect. Reed looked at him for a moment longer. Then he went out with the sergeant, and the sound of feet on the stone floor diminished down the corridor and did not return. The drawing-room held its silence for a moment. Then Miss Finch quite unexpectedly began to cry. Not from distress, or so Hastings judged from the quality of it, but from the particular relief of a sustained tension finally given permission to discharge. Lady Margaret moved to sit beside her and placed one hand over hers on the arm of the chair, which was, for Lady Margaret, an extravagant gesture. Arthur Vale remained at the window, looking out at the causeway and the mainland beyond it, with the expression of a man reconsidering, at some considerable personal cost, the precise dimensions of the road he had been walking. Poirot retrieved his overcoat and hat from Mrs. Penbury in the hall and submitted to her inspection with patient courtesy. "Well," said Mrs. Penbury, examining him with the same dark, assessing look she had turned on him upon his arrival. "You were quick enough." "I endeavour to be," said Poirot. She held his coat for him with the air of a woman making a concession on behalf of a general principle, and said nothing further. Outside, the causeway lay clear in the morning light, the sea on either side of it reduced to a flat, ordinary glitter. Hastings breathed the air, salt certainly, but cold and clean and entirely devoid of atmosphere, which at this particular moment struck him as a very great improvement. "Well," he said, "it's done." "It is done," Poirot agreed. He settled his hat at its correct angle and regarded the causeway with the expression of a man about to put a thing firmly behind him. "There remains only the journey across that extremely disagreeable stone path and the subsequent arrangement of a civilized lunch somewhere on the mainland." He began to walk. "I have been thinking, Hastings, about a particular restaurant in Exeter. The Soul, I am told, is reliable." "Is that really all you're thinking about?" Poirot walked on for several paces before answering. "No," he said, "but it is the most immediately addressable thought." He paused. "The others I shall leave to settle in their own time." The island grew smaller behind them. The sea glittered without comment on either side. Chapter 10. Morning. The restaurant in Exeter was not, in the end, reliable. The Soul was overcooked. The sauce displayed an optimism about garlic that Poirot considered both misplaced and irreversible, and the table had a leg of slightly unequal length that caused it to shift a millimetre each time Hastings reached for the bread. By the time the dessert arrived, Poirot had repositioned his water glass 4 times and abandoned the effort. He ate his pudding with the expression of a man serving out a sentence he has accepted but does not endorse, and said very little until the coffee came. "You are thinking about Reed," Hastings said. "I am thinking about the Soul," Poirot said. "But yes, also Reed." Hastings waited. He was, in many respects, an admirable man. Poirot turned his coffee cup a quarter rotation clockwise and left it there. Patient, methodical, possessed of a very long view, he understood that the most durable structures, whether physical or strategic, require the correct foundation, laid with care before anything is built upon them. He paused. "These are qualities I respect. They are not diminished by the use to which they were put. They are only made more tragic by it." "He killed a man." "He did. In the commission of an act of historical reclamation that was, in its origins, entirely just." Poirot looked at his coffee with the expression of a man who has considered a problem from all available angles and found that it remains a problem, regardless. This is the difficulty with justice as a private enterprise, Hastings. The grievance may be real, the evidence may be genuine, the moral case may be, in its essential structure, sound, and still the method is murder, and murder is what it remains. He drank his coffee. "The courts will determine the legal question. I find I am less certain about the other kind." Hastings had no immediate answer for this, and Poirot did not appear to require one. They sat in the way of men who have been through something together that requires a period of simply sitting before it can be properly filed away. Outside, Exeter conducted its ordinary Tuesday afternoon with the brisk indifference of a city that had not recently been confined to a tidal island in the company of a murderer and a ghost. People moved along the pavement with the purposeful unconsciousness of those who have somewhere in particular to be. A delivery van reversed badly into a side street. Two women compared purchases outside a draper's window with the concentrated attention of specialists. Poirot watched all of this with the particular quality of attention he brought to ordinary life after a case. A heightened appreciation, Hastings had sometimes thought, like the appreciation one brings to warmth after cold. "Lady Margaret," Hastings said. "What will she do, do you think, about the documents?" "I think," Poirot said, "that she will consult a solicitor, who will tell her that the documents are ancient. The legal question is enormously complex, and the practical outcome uncertain. She will then do what she has already decided to do, which is the thing she has been deciding since I mentioned the matter in the drawing-room yesterday morning." He set down his cup. "Lady Margaret Vale is not a woman who requires a solicitor's permission to act according to her conscience. She is a woman who requires time to locate it precisely and courage to follow it. And she has, I observed, an adequate supply of both." "You think she'll give it back?" "I think she will arrive at an arrangement that is something more nuanced than simple restitution and something considerably more honest than the legal minimum. She will do it quietly and without announcement, and in 20 years someone may write a paper about the curious history of the Blackthorn Abbey estate, and it will be a footnote in that paper, and that will suit her perfectly." He stood and retrieved his hat from the empty chair beside him. "She is not, Hastings, a woman who requires applause." They paid and went out into the street. The drive back to London took most of the afternoon. Hastings drove with the undisguised pleasure of a man reunited with a motor car after 3 days of tidal captivity, and Poirot sat beside him in the particular stillness of long journeys, watching the Devon landscape relinquish itself gradually to Somerset and then to Wiltshire. And then, as evening assembled itself along the eastern sky, to the approaching certainty of London. He did not sleep. He thought in the manner he had when a case had closed but not yet quite settled. Not about the solution which was established, but about the edges of it, the places where the logical structure met the human one, and the join was not entirely clean. Reed on the stone slab. Vale at the window. Lady Margaret's hand on Miss Finch's. The hearthstone and its long-preserved leather satchel. The compass rose cut by a Reed ancestor who had understood, without solicitors or courts or the apparatus of formal record, that proof requires safe-keeping. 350 years was a very long time to be careful about something. He was still considering this when Hastings delivered him to Whitehaven Mansions at 8:30. The London evening settling around them with its particular density of noise and lamplight, and the smell of the city resuming its permanent negotiation with its own weather. George took his overcoat and hat with the practiced efficiency of a valet who has learned never to ask questions about return times and confines his inquiries to the purely domestic. "I trust the journey was satisfactory, sir." "The journey was entirely satisfactory, George. The soul in Exeter was not." "I am sorry to hear that, sir. There is a cold supper laid if you are still in need of something." Poirot looked at the mantelpiece. In his absence, George had dusted it. With excellent intentions and imperfect attention, he had replaced the 2 small ornamental figures that occupied its left end in a configuration that was almost correct. The smaller one advanced by precisely 2 centimeters further than its proper position. The larger one rotated a fraction of a degree clockwise. These were small errors. They were, nonetheless, errors. Poirot crossed to the mantelpiece and made the necessary adjustments. The two figures returned to their positions, everything symmetrical. The small Egyptian figurine at the left, the enamel box with the blue lid at the centre, the pair of silver candlesticks at the right, each at its correct angle. A universe of 12 inches in perfect order. He stood for a moment looking at it. Then he sat in his chair and was still in the way he was sometimes still when the day had concluded and the mind, no longer occupied with its task, returns to the things it had set to one side during the business of thinking. He thought about the corridor, not about the explanation, which was complete and entirely satisfactory and admitted of no alternative. The passage behind the wall, the redistributed air, the physics of old buildings disturbed by recent human occupation. All of it accounted for, all of it rational and sufficient. He thought about the cold, how it had been not the cold of damp stone, to which he had by then grown considerably accustomed, but something sharper, directional, as though it had a source rather than a condition. How the candle flame had bent, not in the gradual yielding of a draught, but in a single, definite movement. Sideways and then back, as though something had passed. He thought about Reed's face in the library when he had asked the question, the absence of hesitation, the simplicity of the no. A man who had lied about nothing else offered that single denial with a clarity that Poirot had accepted, and still accepted on the evidence, as truth. He sat with this for some time in the way he sometimes sat with the small residual questions that every case, even the well-resolved ones, left somewhere near its edges, not unsolved, not requiring action, simply present. George brought the cold supper on a tray. Poirot ate it without complaint, which George, who had known him long enough to understand the full implication of this, considered privately to be a good sign. Afterward, Poirot read for a while. He went to bed at his usual hour. He slept well, as he generally did when a case was closed. In the morning, the ornaments on the mantelpiece were precisely where he had left them, which was as they should be and as he had known they would be. He did not check the corridor. There was nothing in the corridor. Of course, there was nothing in the corridor. He breakfasted on tisane and 2 very small, very precisely soft-boiled eggs, and thought about nothing in particular. And the morning came in at the London window with the ordinary, unremarkable light of a city that remembers nothing and forgets nothing, and simply continues, as cities do, regardless. Somewhere off the Devon coast, on its narrow tidal island, Blackthorn Abbey stood in the same light. Its corridors were empty. Its hearthstone covered what it covered. And the tide, indifferent to the affairs of the people it had briefly imprisoned and subsequently released, rose and fell and rose again, as it had for 3 centuries before any of them were born, and would for 3 centuries after all of them were gone. As it always had, as it always would,